So in today's briefing, we're looking at non-religion. So this is a category that describes 37% of the population of England and Wales, according to the 2021 census, whose results came out last week. And in fact, 37% is only 9 percentage points behind those who still affiliate with Christianity. But what does it mean? This non-religion category that's risen from 15% to 37% in the last 20 years. And to help us get to grips with it, we have Dr Lois Lee, Senior Lecturer at the University of Kent, and Principal Investigator on the Understanding Unbelief programme. Dr Hannah Waite, a researcher at the Theos think tank and author of a document on the nons, who are they and what do they believe. Dr David Robertson, Senior Lecturer from the Open University on secularization and other things, and Dr Keith Kahn-Harris, Senior Lecturer at Leo Baeck College, on various things I think you want to raise with us on the census results, Keith. But we'll start with Dr Lois Lee. So thank you for joining us, Lois. You have investigated unbelief. You lecture on religion at the University of Kent. What did you make of the census results that showed this large rise in those who identify as non-religious?
Yeah, it was a large rise. We were expecting a rise, and it was just a question of details to some extent, and I think it was slightly larger than many were expecting. On the other hand, it's in keeping with broader trends that we're aware of. We would have been very surprised if there hadn't been a rise in the number identifying as non-religious, and also if that wasn't related to specifically a decline in people identifying as Christian. I think it's quite an interesting moment, though. So having said, in a way, there weren't great surprises. I think there's a way in which those census results have crystallized some thinking and conversations around changing worldview changes in our country. As I say, those changes we know are happening. They've been ongoing for decades, if not moving into centuries. But there's something about that balance and that shift that makes the British religious, quote unquote, landscape look and feel somewhat different. And I'm saying quote unquote, because I think one of the big shifts that's happening is an awareness that the language of religion may not be fit for purpose at this point. So we talk about religious diversity, if we talk about faith diversity, we use language that's derived from religious traditions, it's maybe going to cease to help us understand what I'm going to now call the worldview landscape in the UK.
So, but when we talk about religious diversity, all we're really saying is there are Muslims, Sikhs, and Jews and Christians. We talk about religious traditions. Why is that language redundant?
It's certainly not redundant for those areas, but now we have a population that are defined by that. So we've got this apparently negative category, the non-religious, that are so large. We really have to sit up and take account of that population. Now, we're not going to get this in the census. All we get is identity information in the census. But what we know from elsewhere are two key things. One, that non-religion is an identity that's distinctive to the UK. So in the UK, people are quite attached to their identity of being non-religious. Atheists, for example, prefer it to the label atheism, although atheism is also popular. And that's different. So the research that you mentioned at the beginning that we've been doing works across various national settings, and no religion is particularly popular in the UK. And that's different, for example, compared with the atheist population in the US. So we are getting identity. This isn't a question of the census measuring religious identities and failing to measure other worldview identities. It's actually measuring a very key identity in the UK. But on the other hand, the other important piece of contextual information is we know that there are changes in beliefs that are going on, and underneath this very generalized identity are a whole set of worldviews and beliefs that aren't well described in that census data.
Okay, so worldviews has come up twice now in the conversation. What do you mean by a worldview? I mean, life after death, is that a worldview?
So, well, there's much debate about that because we are seeing this shift in language in various settings, in media settings, in education, and so on. So, I think it's a slightly tricky, it's being a sort of concept that's being worked out, and let's think about what we mean by it. But I think what people have in mind is an engagement with the fact that we all engage with existential and ethical questions. So those big questions, they're sometimes called, where do we come from? Where do we go? What do the answers to those questions mean for how we live in between? What counts as a good life? And so
So
on.
is
All
it,
of that's going into a worldview.
is it a worldview of belief?
It probably does. Like any religion, it will have a series of beliefs involved, but like we know with religious cultures, beliefs aren't always the most important part of that. It can also be about participating in a particular socio-cultural space. It's about the ideas and beliefs that you find around you, but also the kind of aesthetics, the rituals you participate in, and so on. And that's all, there's space for all of that. All of these things we think about in relation to religious cultures, all of that is going on in the lives of non-religious people as well.
It's complicated, isn't it? Complex, I think, is the word. Thank you, Lois. Of course, we're going to come back to you later, but can we move to Dr. Hannah Waite now? Hannah, you're a researcher at the Theos think tank and author of The Nones. Who are they and what do they believe? So perhaps you could enlighten us.
Yeah, they are an interesting group of people. So the nuns are, as Lois said, the people who identify as non-religious. And I think that Lois made a really good point in saying that is an identity. It's not just a tick box exercise for people, even though it is in the census. I think it is something to remember, is that it is an identity that people hold to quite strongly. So what we find is that the non-religious actually, in our data set, were half of our data set from our 5,000, over 5,000 UK sample. So I think actually, yeah, what I anticipated from the census, if I can say so, is that I actually thought that we would have a higher percentage of non-religious, following some of the other things that had came out with the British Social Attitudes survey. That we find that people who are non-religious are more likely to be millennials, so kind of in the age group of 29, 35 to 40, than anyone who's older. Men are more likely to be non-religious, but I don't think that's maybe a shock to many of us who are in this kind of research area. And yeah, we find that there is different ways in which people who are non-religious believe in certain things or hold worldviews, as Lois said. So some people, that will be that their worldviews are that they are very against, maybe not against is the right word, but don't really practice spirituality or believe in anything spiritual or supernatural, whereas there are other people who are engaged in that but still hold to that identity marker of non-religious.
So you found these three categories of non-religion, and in those three categories, you found that there was religion. Would that sum it up?
No, I don't think that's right, because it's not, we're not trying to say that there are people who are non-religious that are practice religion. What we're saying is that there are people who are non-religious that aren't straightforwardly against any form of spirituality. So whenever I'm talking about spiritual aspects of what they're interested in, that could be many different things. So it could be that people believe in ghosts, angels, life after death, prayer, the healing power of crystals. So it kind of incorporates quite a large aspect. So I think it's unfair to say that we find religion in that, especially because people themselves who identify as non-religious would be quite uncomfortable with that. So I wouldn't want to say that.
But you find it within non-religion, you find spirituality.
Yes. Yeah, I would be comfortable in saying that.
So it's all in the definition of religion, I suppose, is it?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it's also what other people are comfortable with. I think if someone actively is identifying themselves as not something, it's quite unfair for us to then say, well, no, in my mind, you are this way. And it's only a third of that group of the non-religious that we would say are spiritual, but they identify themselves as not being religious. So I think that they're the classic category that is actually quite loose and maybe not the best defined, is that they are not religious but spiritual. And I think it's that they're exploring spirituality and other aspects, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're exploring religion or even exploring one facet of religion. It might be that there's some parts of Buddhism that they're quite interested in. There's some parts of Christianity, some parts of Judaism. there's different aspects of religion that they're interested in and investigating.
And did you find in your research that among the non-religious there was affiliation of any kind to any group, or was it just a collection of individual ideas and thoughts?
In what way do you mean, like affiliation to any?
Well, amongst the non-religious, are there cases of people wanting to affiliate with others with similar ideas, or are people happier to be individual and go it alone?
I will say that our data didn't necessarily ask that specific thing, so I don't want to say from our data, but I think that there's a mix. The same way there's a mix in people who are religious. Some people are quite happy to practice their religion independently. Some people like to be part of a group, and you can see that even with, non-religious people who are quite comfortable in their non-religion and don't really want to practice that or talk about it with other people. Or there's people who are involved in, for example, the Humanist Society or the Sunday Assembly. So I think there's a similar thing of in both groups that it's more of an independence thing of what people prefer and how to outwork that identity.
Thank you, Hannah. And again, I'm sure we'll come back to you, but can we move to Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris? Amongst your many titles, you're a senior lecturer at the Leo Baeck College. I wonder if you might give your opinion also on what you made of the census and what you've heard so far as people have been trying to understand what non-religion is.
The census was certainly eagerly awaited in the Jewish community. Because Jews are often very concerned about issues about how many of us there are. And what we found is that in England and Wales, the number is more or less steady at just over 270,000. Although a lot of that holding steady is because of the rapid growth of the strictly Orthodox community and concomitantly the lower birth rate and decline of what we sometimes call somewhat problematically mainstream Jewry. But I should say that the religion question isn't hugely satisfactory, speaking personally, and I think many other people that we know. Pragmatically, there's always been a big push for Jews to answer the religion question, which indeed we have. But it doesn't really satisfactorily capture the multifaceted aspects of Jewish identity. And where religion and non-belief and ethnicity and nationhood and peoplehood and cultural identity, all of that tend to be wrapped up together. Judaism is if you would call it a religion, it's one that emphasizes practice. Not that belief is insignificant, but it is very much a doing kind of thing. It's quite uncomfortable for many of us to when the word faith is spoken, because it sort of reflects the centrality of faith in Christianity, whereas in Judaism it's important, but doesn't quite have that centrality. We certainly know that many people who might describe themselves as secular Jews, in fact, do practices that some people would call religious, like having a Passover meal. Or in Israel, there are people who understand themselves as secular who do a Passover meal and maybe fast on Yom Kippur. So as I say, it's a category that isn't great, but it is one that pragmatically Jews do engage with because we need to engage with it. But one of the things that was really, really interesting about this census is there is also the ethnicity question with a write-in box where you can put Jewish. And with the census results, we also discovered that over 67,000 people had marked Jewish on the ethnicity question, attached to a range of different ethnic self-identities. And that's an increase of it's doubled since 2011. And in 2001, it was only 12,000. Now, what we don't know, the research will be done by one of the organizations that I work for, the Institute of Jewish Policy Research. We don't know who marked both religion and ethnicity as Jewish. I certainly did, but I don't know how many people there are. Certainly in previous censuses, there's been a huge overlap between the two, and it only adds maybe a few thousand to the total number of self-identified Jews when you combine the two questions. But the increase is so dramatic this time that I think it's likely that this is a deliberate decision of some kind. And certainly the Board of Deputies of British Jews is now calling for Jewish to be an option in the next section on the ethnicity question. My own hypothesis of this, and it's a hypothesis I think that extends to the wider census findings on people who do not see themselves as religion, is that there seems to be a rapid collapse in the desire to recognize one's own nominal religious affiliation or default religious affiliation. I don't think that people who might have described themselves as Christian 20 years ago are not describing themselves now as such necessarily means some kind of spiritual crisis or change of spiritual beliefs, so much as that sense of a default religion that, you know, defining it as the congregation that you don't go to, is probably on the wane, and it might possibly be on the wane in the Jewish community, but there is a long way to go before we can possibly establish that. But I have to say that I think the best way of describing Judaism is as an ethno-religion. And Jews are not the only example of that. That describes Sikh identity quite well. It describes some forms of Muslim identity quite well. It even describes some forms of Christian identity quite well, such as African Christianity, in which the dividing line between ethnic identification and religious identification is extremely blurred. And we have to deal with the census we have, and we also recognize that there are a limited number of questions that can be on it. But at the moment, there are we have hypotheses, but we can't necessarily make firm conclusions, both about Jews but also about other groups as well.
But can I just pick you up on something you were talking about earlier, which was going back to this category of non-religion. If a Jewish person, you spoke about secular Jews in Israel, for example, if a person self-describes as a secular Jew, what is it about Judaism that they are rejecting? Is it beliefs? Is it ritual? Is it affiliation? What are they rejecting when they say that they're a secular Jew?
Well, I mean, that depends on the person, but it doesn't necessarily mean rejection of affiliation, even of affiliation to a synagogue. It may involve a rejection of belief in Jewish religious precepts. It may sometimes be a rejection of Jewish practices. And it sometimes may be a rejection of Jewish affiliation, at least those bits of it that are synagogue-based. But it's a complex category, and it doesn't necessarily mean the same as other forms of self-identified secularism. There is a long-standing tradition of Jewish secular identity and modernity, but it's important not to mistake that for seeing that as something that is necessarily antithetical to Jewish religious organizations, because it isn't necessarily. It can be, it might not be.
Thank you, Keith. And I'm bringing our final panelist, Dr. David Robertson from the Open University. David, we normally speak to you about QAnon and other new religious movements, but you have written about secularization and spoken about this with Professor Linda Woodhead, who we've spoken to earlier on the census results. So just in that framework, as you looked at the census results and you saw the increasing numbers of people ticking non-religion, what did you think? Were you surprised, or what did you detect in that finding?
Well, I'd also been part of the Census Stories project last year, where a number of universities and other bodies actually created public-facing. We did a little course with some videos, which was unpacking the results of the last census ahead of the results of this one being released. So I was quite familiar with the results of the 2011 census. And I was not surprised really I mean, what came out was pretty much what could have been predicted if you plotted from 2001, when the question was first answered, to 2011. If you just plotted that line of non-religious going up and Christian going down, it was pretty close to being what you would have expected. So I wasn't very surprised there.
What do you know about the non-religious? Have you ever studied them, or what parallels do you see in this debate as into all the work that you've done on secularization, the growth of secularization?
Well, I mean, I'm constantly being surprised here how we're talking about these people like they're, you know, the non-religious. What are they like? I mean, I am one. I'm in Scotland. Almost everybody I know in my age group is one. This is not a particularly new thing. It's worth pointing out that Scotland is slightly further ahead. We had 51% identifying as Christian in the 2011 census. We were about 7% ahead. So if the presuming the same trajectory continues, then we might actually have non-religion being the largest religious group in Scotland, which is interesting. Maybe, not sure about that. It'll be closer than it is in England and Wales anyway. What does that have to do with secularization, or how does it relate to secularization? Well, I'll try and answer as quickly as possible, but I'll be doing some violence to some of the details, I think. The very earliest people kind of studying religion way back the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries, you know, people like Durkheim and Max Weber, they were talking about the decline of religion then. It was just assumed that this was a thing that was happening as part of modernity. And then that kind of re-emerges when what we think of as religious studies now, the sort of modern study of religion, re-emerges in the 60s and 70s. And, you know, the secularization thesis, as we tend to call it, was a central part of the study of religion at that period. It was just assumed that religion was in decline in the West as part of modernity. There was debate as to what that actually meant. Most of the earlier work on secularization was more interested in measurable things like church attendance. So church attendance has long been in decline. But that's not what we're talking about here in these census. This is identification, which is a completely different matter. And as Keith points out correctly, that's often tied up with a lot of other kinds of identities, you know, ethnic identity, cultural identity. And it's true for Christians in Britain as well. Christian identity, for instance, if you look at the case of Northern Ireland, is deeply entangled with lots of other forms of identification.
But I don't understand why the two aren't connected. Isn't the rise of non-religion entirely about a more secular society?
Not necessarily. I mean, the United States is an ostensibly secular nation, and yet the rates of identification as Christian there are still close to 80%, depending on which data you use. I think a factor that's not been sort of flagged is that actually the relationship of religious institutions and the state is a very important factor. It's not at all surprising to me that minority groups and ethno-religions, as Keith termed them, have stronger identification is holding more strongly there. Whereas there's a clear connection in states where Christianity is associated with forces of liberation or resistance. Identifying as Christian has held up far better than in countries where that's not the case. So in Britain, particularly, obviously. So in United States, for instance, Christianity was an important aspect of the difference between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and that possibly is a factor. It's clear from the countries in Europe where Christianity is still has strong rates of identification, such as Spain and Poland, where the Christian churches were very much connected with resistance in various forms. In Poland, particularly, the Catholic Church are seen by a lot of people in Poland as, being on the Polish side resistance against the Soviet Union, and so therefore they don't see them in the same way. They don't have the same relationship to power as they do in other parts of Europe, particularly.
Thank you, David. Lois, I think you want to come back in again.
Yeah, brilliant. Really interesting thoughts across those contributions. But just picking up on what David's saying about secularization and the complexity there, I think one thing that needs to happen as a result of where we're at is understanding that secularization is a more complicated story. I mean, one of the controversies coming out now is a question of whether we have non-religionized, so we have a large number of people who identify as non-religious, but we're maybe not as secular as we should be. And so those debates about the bishops in the House of Lords, etc., what are our institutional arrangements, a totally different dimension to secularity. So saying now we have lots of people identifying as non-religious, we're therefore more secular, doesn't capture some of that complexity. But what I think we need to think about is the secularization language, way of thinking itself arises out of a very religion-centered way of thinking that itself might not be fit for purpose, and it leads us to ask those questions. It leads us to think about the collapse of religion. Ruth, you asked, why are people rejecting their religion? Well, we don't know that they are rejecting their religion so much as they have alternative forms. There are other ideas and cultural spaces that are more salient to them, and that sort of sense of opposition to religion does not reflect the experience of all of the non-religious. It definitely reflects the experience of people who have left a religion, and especially when that's been a traumatic process. But for lots of people, this generation David's pointing to, where it's the norm, they don't have that same experience, and there's a sort of slight obsession with how has religion failed, rather than saying what are the points of connection that are going on. And there's a downside to that kind of really narrow idea, this sort of debate of what counts as really religious, in that I think it narrows our conversation quite substantially, because we do find there's a great phrase that Denise Cush has, that people have non-binary worldview identities. And actually people with non-religious identities, so there's that great shift we see from Christian identities to the non-religious, and that reflects what goes on in lots of people's lives. There's a sense of connection with Christian cultural references. They maybe do go to church at Christmas, but their atheist beliefs might also really matter. And saying, as Hannah put so well, saying, well, they're really religious, just doesn't capture the changes that have taken place. But our language at the moment doesn't allow us to say, what are the kind of points of cultural exchange that are going on? It forces people to say, or, well, I participate in that religion, but only, it's not really religious when I participate. Well, why do we need to say whether something's really religious or not? There's a whole lot of kind of cultural diversity that has meaning for all of us. And it goes both ways, by the way. We're very bad at understanding how non-religious cultures shape religious lives. So the way that, this great humanist tradition, whatever it might be, whether it's sort of E.M. Forster's sort of humanist tradition that shapes the lives and thinking of a Christian, someone identifies as Christian, we really need to be much better at understanding what's going on, that kind of cultural exchange.
So it's not as simple as saying, well, people just don't believe in God anymore. And you look at the rise of non-religion, you wonder why it happened. Was there a push towards secularization that made it unpopular to believe in anything beyond human beings?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different threads going on, and as David's already alluded to, the kind of ways in which those changes happen are very, there's lots of diverse things going on. There are institutional changes there. Some societies have pluralized in their worldviews, which have forced them to rearrange how their institutions are organized and make them more secular, which has knock-on effects. There is an emergence of, I think there's a lot of debate about, was Darwin, was he himself an atheist or Christian? I think actually that's a moot point, but what he is part of is the development of a British atheist culture that gave rise to people I've just mentioned, Forster, and a whole kind of intellectual trajectory that normalized, made sense of, and created an atheist culture that makes sense to lots of people and isn't sort of challenging or upsetting or about rejecting Christian beliefs. It's about something making sense in the particular moment in history and culture that they find themselves.
Thanks, Lois. David, you had your hand up.
I did, thank you. I wanted to just kind of take what Lois was saying there, and I'd been hinting at a little further, which is to say, I think a lot of the confusion over these results and the way that they're being interpreted has to do with perhaps an overly simplistic idea of what religion is. And I mean, we immediately started having a conversation about beliefs, but the box isn't about what you believe, it's about what you identify as. Religion is not a single thing. Religion, when used casually, could be referring to a cultural identity, it could be referring to a set of beliefs, it could be referring to a set of practices. And it's pointless for us as academics to say, oh no, actually it should mean this thing. People are using it in different ways. And especially, I think, in these kind of surveys and journalism particularly, people are really holding on to a far more simplistic and perhaps old-fashioned notion of, well, religion is about your beliefs. I mean, we still continue to refer to them as faiths, for instance, which really doesn't work for a lot of the world's religions. And I know that came from a good place originally, but it does sort of underline that continues to be the way that we think about things. And something that has happened, and Lois mentioned this already, that there has been a shift in language in the way that religion is talked about popularly. And one obvious example of this is the emergence of the term spirituality, right? Which didn't really come from scholars, it came from popular usage. But ordinary people nowadays will regularly differentiate between spiritual and religious, and religion usually implies kind of institutions and being a member of a community or whatever, whereas spirituality often refers to beliefs, but also particular practices that are related to those beliefs, right? And they separate those out, although actually often, if we used religion in a scholarly context or a more traditional way, we might not be making that separation in such an obvious way. And so I think that actually is largely related to a lot of the time people will increasingly tend to say, well, I'm not religious because I'm not going to church, or I'm not, formally a member of something. Whereas perhaps 20, 30 years ago, they would have been quite happy to just say that they were religious.
Just actually going off what David was saying there about the difficulty of defining religion, my colleague Nick is actually in the audience. We've been working on a project about science and religion, and one of the questions that we asked people was, how would you define religion? And I think that that's a really important part of that, is that how we understand religion is so varied from person to person, which means that, yeah, it's quite complicated and hard to understand. It's not just about beliefs and practices, but it is also about your cultural identity. And that's obviously, being from Northern Ireland, what we see here is that there's people, for example, and my sister won't mind me sharing this, my sister is not religious. She used to describe herself as atheist, but she's like, no, that doesn't feel quite right, because I believe in ghosts and I believe in these spiritual aspects and things. But she'd still say, I'm a Protestant. She'll still make that hard and fast definition. And I'm like, well, what does that actually mean? So I think that there is an aspect of what we see in the census is, again, that identity marker, rather than necessarily as what David and Lois are talking about, is beliefs and practices. But I think it's still important to realize that people hold to that identity marker for a reason. So whether that be that some people are holding to the identity marker of a religion or of a not religion, there's something in them innate that makes them connect to that identity. And maybe actually one of the things that we should be exploring, not that we can in the census because I'm where it's limited, is what is that point of connection, kind of, that Lois was talking about with cultures and things, but what's that point of connection that we're seeing in religion that's making people connect to that as their identity?
I'd just like to throw a question to all of you now, actually. So we're the Religion Media Centre, right? And our aim is to help the media report religion. And from this sea of complexity that you've all outlined, what should we be doing? I'm going to put Lois on the spot first of all.
Well, it is on the spot because I think that we probably need to move towards a more embracing language so that we can have the conversations that we're talking about and accurately reflect our landscape today, whether that means it's the Worldview Media Centre That's where I feel on the spot, because I think there are some debates around that terminology. That itself maybe reflects those kind of Christian ways of thinking in which faith is centralized. It's very cognitive. What's your view of the world? It sounds a bit embracing. It could fit a little bit too easily into a kind of clash of civilizations narrative, like this is my worldview and that's your worldview, which doesn't maybe embrace what I was talking about earlier, Denise Cush's idea about non-binary identities and kind of different points of connection with different cultures. So I think that language is imperfect, but I think it is being worked very hard at the moment, and that's the right thing to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why you say it's complicated, and in a sense it could be, but it could also be quite simple, which is just abandon the idea that religion is always a question of beliefs. So I think for journalists to as simple as just remembering that religion could also, like, or identifying as a religion in a census could also mean cultural identity. It could be talking about behaviors. It could be talking about ideas. It could be simply something that you were raised in and you continue to identify in for familiar reasons. The more that journalists can bear that in mind when they're writing about census results, I think that will be enormously helpful in just bringing a little bit of nuance and I don't want to say complexity, but I think it'll let us start having different conversations about religion that actually more accurately reflect the lives of people.
I think it's hard for me to tell you what's best for you moving forward. But I do think that, yes, I think that religion is definitely a broader category than what we think it is. But I would say that I think that there is, for many people, beliefs are really ingrained in how they understand religion. So I think that maybe part of what we need to do is not just say that it's unhelpful language, but try and figure out what we actually mean by religion. Do we mean something that's spiritual? Do we mean it's something that's practiced? Do we mean it's an identity marker? Is it notions about the physical world? You know, there's certain religions that are more about the supernatural and the spiritual, whereas there are religions that are more about practice and how in which you interact with fellow humans in society. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, unfortunately, Ruth.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a challenging question because it feels like this is just clutching something that isn't there. Someone once said to me, you know, philosophy doesn't sell newspapers. Give us a story about these complex ideas. You know, what's the story? But anyway, that's something else. Thank you for indulging me on that question. There is something here in the chat box, a question from Sorcha. How have the academics viewed religious reactions to this, and what can religions learn from this specifically? I mean, the Archbishop of Canterbury said when he was asked a question in Ukraine, you know, how can you stop this? And he said, well, basically, he said, I'm paraphrasing, you know, he's doing his best. He wasn't reading comics in a room somewhere. I think this is actual description. But he said that it wasn't irreversible. He said in the questions that it was possible to get the percentages going round the other way. And I just wonder, you know, what's your response to what he had to say and what he said at Lois?
I think, as I said already, I think there's a focus on what religion's doing wrong and how they can stop it. And I think it overstates the kind of agency that any religious group has. I think the reason, I think he's right in a sense that we have this idea of secularization as somewhat inevitable, and actually it's a process of cultural change, and that's not kind of linear or inevitable in that way. But on the other side of the coin, it's so embedded in our culture, our society. One thing that Hannah's pointed to really importantly is that what the census does show is identity shifts, and census, we know from sort of work of people at Abbey Day, tends to particularly record an idea of religious identity that's tied with our national and ethnic identity. And so what might be surprising in these data is that we're seeing a real kind of clear shift in non-religion being a kind of new normal and being associated with people's national and ethnic identities in a new way. So being British and being non-religious are tied together in many people's minds. I think that's one thing that the census is showing us, and that's really ingrained in huge amounts of detail. We're about to kind of move into to Christmas, which has very important Christian and other religious threads, but it also has become a humanist festival in many ways. You know, from those big Christmas movies to, I don't know if this is a safe space and we can admit that we might have been moved by a Christmas advert along the way or something, but those kinds of humanist, often very humanist ethics, a time of year in which it's not about Christianity versus kind of rank consumerism. Those are parts of the picture, but there's a big space that we don't always acknowledge, which is about a kind of humanist, ethical conversation that goes on, people working out how they want to approach this festival. Shelters and food banks oversubscribed at this time of year because people have a very strong ethical connection, which is sometimes refracted through their Christian beliefs, but sometimes, and increasingly often, refracted through humanist beliefs. It's so embedded. So to see a reverse in numbers, we're talking about a very major change. I don't think that's going to happen for centuries, let's say. You know, it's so ingrained in our society, and I think maybe this census moment is a point to reflect a bit on that and think about those different kind of cultural threads.
Where does the motivation for giving at Christmas and feeling moved come from?
Well, I think it is a very existential moment people reflect on. It is what we think of as a religious festival. It's a point at which people think about big questions of life in different ways. They do it in practice, as David's pointing out to. It's not always about thinking. It's not necessarily. It's about the kind of extensive debates I'm having with my sister about what narrative do I tell about Father Christmas's giving? Do I moralize it as being about being a good child? What does that mean for poorer children? All of those debates, which you might sort of see as tangential, are about a kind of reflection on what counts as a good life, about reflecting on our connections with family, what matters to us, and so on. And that endures, but the meaning has changed. And I think we probably need to accept that at this point. The last British Social Attitude Survey showed that we now have more people who say they don't believe in God in this country than those who say they do. And that's the first time that's ever happened. So this is the beginning of perhaps an atheist age in the UK. And there's a lot of a reckoning we need to make to that and think about what that means and not be frightened of it, because we're all living our lives, we're all participating in all sorts of diverse ways. Our experience of being part of local and national communities isn't frightening, but when we sort of see those big changes writ large, I think there's often a sense of kind of panic. What does it mean? What have we lost? There's a lot of subtle things going on there, and I think if we take a breath and think about what it actually means in kind of more detail.
This idea that it's the beginning of the atheist age, doesn't that depend on the definition of God?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of things we do in our research ask people what they think God is and so on, and all of these survey questions are intrinsically limited. They tell us something, but they do tell us something about a shift. So and what I think is possibly not always recognized is how recent we've got to this point of having very widespread non-religious and atheist identities and atheist beliefs. So I think it was 1977 where registry office weddings outnumbered religious weddings for the first time. I think it was 1993 when the British Social Attitude Survey had a higher number of people identifying as non-religious than religious, but don't quote me on that figure. I think that's about right. And so there's a generation, of which I am one, who have grown up with non-religion being normal in the kind of particular area I grew up in. But we really are in some senses the first generation. And now we've got to this other shift, which is that a lot of people say they don't believe in God. You're absolutely right, Ruth. What does that mean? All sorts of things. But what it is indicating is some kinds of change that are going on. So academics obviously want to sit around and think about what that means forever and ever, and it's something we've interviewed people about in our what did you mean when you answered that question. We've specifically done that in understanding unbelief. So there's a picture of change.
So for those religious traditions who are viewing this quite anxiously and looking at proselytizing and evangelism, is that a mistake?
I can understand the anxiety to be in any cultural space that feels like it's getting smaller rather than bigger, and that's true in all sorts of areas. But I think it possibly overstates the difference between religious and non-religious. We tend to think of that as the ultimate divide. And actually that nuance that David's talking about is often much more important. There's often a much greater difference between a very conservative Christian and a very liberal Christian than there is between a Christian and a non-religious person in the abstract. There's a lot of exchange. And if you start looking at thinking less about religious decline and more about worldview change, you can open up to that and think about those points of connection that might be there and the ways in which our cultural traditions continue. So the non-religious are still engaged with historic religious cultures and new and emerging religious ideas at the same time. But Hannah's exactly right. We don't have to force them back into traditional ways, say, well, that means you're traditionally religious or so on, which I don't think reflects the reality. But I think that if we think about worldview change rather than religious decline, we can at least have a slightly less fatalistic way of thinking about what's going on, and think about how do we engage, how do we broaden interfaith spaces so that they're cross worldview spaces. What does that mean? How do I participate in that? And I mean, I'm always a glass half full person, but I feel like there's a lot of opportunity from a religious perspective to engage with the landscape as it is in really constructive and interesting ways. Maybe we could focus on that.
Is there any fear? Do you have any fears about, for example, the basis on which moral, ethical decisions will be made in the future if there are no reference points to tradition?
I don't think there are no reference points to traditions. That's the thing. And this language of decline makes it seem like that's the case. But actually, we carry cultural changes, don't throw away those traditions. They just engage with them and adapt them in new ways. We bring those with us. I think what makes me potentially frightened is the way that we think about decline, so that spaces in which we have to let people have existential and ethical questions will, I think, become more and more vulnerable over time if we continue to say they should only be peopled with people with religious identities. So thinking about a media perspective, if we have a kind of national crisis, a terrorist attack or so on, we, as many people as individuals and we as a broader community, want to engage with people who I think of as having kind of existential expertise that help us cope with these unfathomable events. And at the moment we turn to someone like the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they're obviously very important. Those kind of religious figures are an important touchstone, but we do need to make space and think about identifying spokespeople from outside of those religious institutions, partly because they less and less reflect people with religious identities who don't always affiliate with institutions in the same way, and also that they don't reflect the worldviews of people with humanist beliefs and so on. And we see this on a much smaller scale. If you think about chaplaincy in hospitals providing support to people at difficult moments, and there's been a move to open that up to including humanist chaplaincy and so on. And I think that's what needs to happen. We need to broaden those spaces, because the alternative is we devalue that kind of existential and ethical support and they disappear altogether. And that there's a certain anxiety I have around that.
Thank you, Lois. Sorry for that string of questions. Very interesting conversation. David, you wanted to come back.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, there were conversations for a long time about the sort of idea of religion having a resurgence at times of political crisis or social crisis. I mean, that was certainly something that was talked about around the sort of world wars, and that there was an increase in church attendance and things. But we've just lived through 2 incredibly turbulent decades, and there hasn't really been this resurgence in the same way that there was in the middle of the 20th century. Now, what that suggests to me is, as Lois was kind of suggesting, that there is a large percentage of the population who, incidentally, now are the main working population, like your older millennials, younger Generation X, who are living through financial meltdowns, pandemics, and all the rest of it, without feeling the need for recourse to the moral teachings of traditional forms of religion for support. And that is perhaps unexpected, but it's, the empirical pattern is there. Were were there an intrinsic need in society for the moral support of religious institutions, we should have seen it over the last decade, and we really haven't.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much indeed for taking part in that discussion, which got very academic at many points. I'm sure that we'll return to it again in the new year. But you're right, Lois. It was a major moment of shift, I think, or one of recognition. So thank you for helping us understand what's going on, and thank you for joining us. See you at the next weekly briefing.